Story number 1. I didn't see the blue light until it was already washing the bus in the color of drowned things. I didn't hear the city, only the slow pulse of the engine, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I didn't plan to ride all the way to the river, but the night had a way of lengthening the road. I didn't believe in omens, yet every reflection in the window looked a second too late. I didn't know the driver's name, but she knew mine before I said a word. There are choices you make when you're feeling righteous, little monuments to your better self that look noble for about 5 minutes and then curdle into shame. My mistake was small. I let a date fall apart and told myself integrity was worth the empty bed. The reward was a night bus that smelled like spilled beer, wet wool, and metal warmed by too many tired bodies. Outside, the city dragged its lights along the slick streets like a dress with a torn hem. I sat in the middle rows, halfway between the abandoned and the saved, and pretended not to notice the pair at the back. They were loud the way people get when silence terrifies them. Boots on the bar, hair like warning signs, laughter without humor. I've met that kind before, the kind that would rather be feared than seen. I kept my eyes forward, counting the gummy streaks on the window. The driver was a big woman with soft shoulders and a jaw like a locked door. I couldn't see her eyes in the mirror, but I felt when she tilted it toward me. A glance is a small rescue. It says, I know what you're pretending not to hear. The first insult was lazy, the second, inventive, the third, made to stick. I told myself to let it pass, but righteousness has a half-life, and mine was already decaying. When I finally turned and answered, it wasn't clever. It was the sound a person makes when they're tired of flinching. Chairs shuddered. The aisle rang with footsteps. The pair slid down the bus as if the floor was a tilted deck and I was a drain. Move, one of them said, but I heard what he meant. Make me. I didn't. The hands on my shoulders were strong in that careless way, like they'd never been taught the difference between a touch and a claim. The seat caught my spine and reminded me that pain is good at math. It counts backwards from your bravado until you're paying in breath. The driver's voice rolled down the aisle, calm and deadly serious. The words were simple. Stop. Sit. Enough. But something in the tone rearranged the air. The pair didn't stop. Not really. They were that particular kind of courageous that only exists when there's no consequence. I moved forward to the space just behind the driver and asked when the next stop was. Soon, she said. Her voice was a low tide that pulled the heat out of me. Stay there. She glanced up into the mirror. They'll follow. People talk about adrenaline like it's fireworks. That's not true. Adrenaline is arithmetic. It reduces your choices to smaller and smaller numbers until you're left with one. I could stand and make a scene. I could sit and make a target. I could get off in the wrong neighborhood and make a headline. Or I could trust the stranger whose eyes I still hadn't seen. They didn't want the driver to have authority. They wanted the bus to be a raft, and themselves the river. Their words got filthier because they were trying to make the world match their mouths. When one of them grabbed me by the collar to tilt my face back and mark me, the bus tilted too, as if it had decided we were all done pretending gravity was a rule instead of a habit. My head met plastic, and my breath stuttered. The driver stood. She did not shout. She declared. The bus believed her. The pair didn't. Every story has a point where it can go feral. That was ours. The bigger one smiled. Without his eyes. The other rolled his cuff back, the way a person does when they're trying on menace to see if it fits. The aisle narrowed. The windows felt farther away than glass should ever feel. I counted rows to keep from counting regrets, and tried not to think about how the night swallows the names of people who are humiliated, and then hurt. The driver kept the bus straight with one hand, and the situation straight with the other. Sit, she said again. This time they answered with the dull gleam of a blade. It wasn't big. It didn't have to be. Something changed then. Not in me. In the bus. The lights didn't flicker. The engine didn't sputter. But the shadows stretched up the walls with patient hands. And for a moment, the windows showed nothing of London at all. Only a grid of reflected rows sailing through a darkness that felt like depth. I told myself, shock makes tricks, and tricks make ghosts. The driver said nothing. She slid back into her seat, set both hands on the wheel, and we gathered speed. That was when the road walked out from under us, like a rug being pulled by an invisible host who had been waiting for this exact moment since the city was old. That was when the driver did not brake, but steered into the absence ahead. As if she had memorized the shape of a wall none of us could see. That was when I realized the bus wasn't just a bus. It was a decision. We didn't crash. We arrived. That's the only way I can explain it. One heartbeat, we were barreling through a corridor of sodium lamps. The next, we were nose to nose with a surface that accepted us like a wave accepts a swimmer. The sound the bus made wasn't metal or glass. It was a kind of hush that reminded me of winter mornings when every sound is padded by frost. The bigger one flew forward, arms windmilling in slow theater, a puppet whose strings had been cut by an unamused god. The blade spun away and settled at my feet. My hands didn't move. I've never trusted how quickly panic makes brave promises. The driver rose. Up close, she was even larger. But it wasn't size that quieted me. It was composure. She didn't look at the fallen man. She looked past him, toward the windshield, where no street should have been, and yet a street was. A narrow lane that bent toward a darkness that did not belong to the city. "Stay with me," she said. It wasn't a request. It was the rule that keeps a boat from capsizing when everyone wants to run to one side and look. The smaller one tried to be a hero in his own story and found out the narrative wasn't taking suggestions. The driver stepped forward with the unstoppable gravity of someone who has already forgiven you, but won't let you ruin the ending. He swung. She didn't move enough to call it a dodge. She moved enough to remind him that space obeyed her more than it obeyed him. He went down. She sat on him. It was almost funny. It would have been, if not for the way the air felt like a throat trying to swallow something too large. I realized then that the bus door was open. The night outside wasn't the night we left. It was an older night, worn smooth by repetition. There was a curb, but no pavement. A curb the color of wet slate, with no city attached to it. Far off, a river sounded like a long breath taken by a sleeping house. "Don't step out," the driver said. "It remembers footsteps." I didn't ask what it was. I could feel what she meant. The way some places collect the weight of what happens in them and become more place than map. "Who are you?" I asked. Because fear makes manners curious. "Working," she said, as if that were all a person needed to be. "And you're riding," the bigger man groaned. He wasn't harmless anymore. He was heavy with embarrassment, and the need to prove it was all a misunderstanding called dignity. He rose with hands that had learned nothing. The driver didn't look at him. She looked through the windshield again, measuring the angle of a road we had no right to be on. The bus rolled forward a few inches, then settled. I swear, it sighed. But I'm not giving that to the night. I'm giving that to fatigue. "Why here?" I asked. "Because here is where they go when they forget the bus isn't theirs," she said. "And because you looked at me when the mirror did." I told her I didn't understand. She said that was all right. Understanding is a luxury. Compliance is a responsibility. "Hands on the rail," she said to the two of them, backs to the glass. The smaller one obeyed. The larger one hesitated. The bus lights dimmed the precise amount required to remind him that electricity is a pact, and he hadn't signed it. He obeyed. We waited. I don't know for how long. The city does time like a marching band. This place did time like tide pools, leaving you alone with your reflection and the little creatures that can survive without the ocean for a while. The driver retrieved the blade with a handkerchief and dropped it into a compartment that looked too shallow to hide anything. She wiped her hands and the wheel with that same careful patience people reserve for sacred things and children's faces. Then she nodded to herself and looked at me the way a teacher looks at the one kid who's pretending to read ahead. "You'll stay until we're back," she said. I told her I would. I meant it. When the police lights finally curled into view beyond the glass, they weren't red and blue. They were the brittle white of fluorescent tubes and the warm gold of hall lamps. I saw a face in the reflection that looked like mine after a long illness. The bus door closed, the lane folded, the city stitched around us with needlepoint precision. The driver sat, and the bus rejoined the map like a bead sliding back onto a string. The pair became small again, the way trouble does when it meets a boundary. The blade was gone. The driver's mirror found my eyes and held them like a parent crosses a street with a child. We rolled on. Outside, the river turned in its sleep. I should have asked how she knew where the lane was. I should have asked why the door gave on to a curb with no pavement. I should have asked what it remembers when it remembers footsteps. Instead, I asked what stop would be safest, as if safety were a place and not a person with wide shoulders and a voice that kept the night in its seat. "Two more," she said. "You get off with me." It wasn't a question. The smaller one muttered. The larger one glared at the window as if glass could be cowed. I stared at the route map that never made sense after midnight. Neighborhood names might as well be spells then, syllables that can summon you to your worst habit. I tried to remember the way home without drawing a map in my head that included corners where I shouldn't have turned. We passed a shuttered bakery, a sleeping laundrette, a building with too many satellite dishes, like barnacles on a ship that had never seen the sea. At the stop before mine, a man in a suit stood under the shelter reading a receipt as if it had judged him. He didn't look up when the bus didn't stop. He didn't look up when every light at the shelter went out at once. He didn't look up when they all came back on, but one. Maybe he lived in the older night and only borrowed hours to buy cigarettes. The last stop announced itself with a little chime inside the vehicle's bones. But I promised to keep this story free of the small sounds people use to pretend they have control. The driver parked with a precision that made the road feel like a problem set she'd already solved. She stood, and I followed, and so did the pair, because there is a kind of authority that works even on men who hate authority. "Out," she told them, and the command had an address. It didn't mean out to the pavement. It meant out to that other curb, the slate one, the one with no city. The door opened onto ordinary London, the The door stayed open long enough for the air to ask a question. Then, like a mouth that knows better than to finish a dangerous sentence, it closed again. We were 4 people in a box with more history than paint. "I'm not going anywhere with you," the larger one said, which is usually something said by someone who has already left himself behind. The driver didn't bother answering. She held out her hand. "Fare?" He looked confused. "We already paid." She shook her head. "Not that fare. The other kind. The kind you owe a stranger who didn't let you ruin your life tonight." I don't know what he expected. A fine? An apology? The bus had a different price in mind. The lights along the aisle extended themselves by the smallest fraction and touched his boots. He flinched. It looked like a trick of reflection until it wasn't. The driver's hand stayed out. "Choose," she said. "Your voice or your memory of this road." He didn't understand. He chose wrong. Most of us do the first time. He chose to keep both. The bus accepted the choice the way a sea accepts a stone. No drama, just a fact. He spoke then, a rush of syllables jammed together, a threat assembled from spare parts. And then he was speaking no more. His throat worked. No sound. The smaller one tried to laugh, but found that his memory of this route had curdled into a blank so wide it scared him. He didn't know what street we were on. He didn't know where he lived. He looked at the windows for help and found only himself, over and over, getting smaller each time. "Don't test the bus," the driver said gently, as if offering advice about casserole temperatures. "It keeps its own books." We stood there for a long breath. The city went by outside, indifferent and awake. The driver turned to me. "You?" I had nothing left to offer except what I still carried. "What's my fare?" I asked. "A story," she said. "Tell me what you saw tonight, but tell it the way the night would tell it about you." I tried. I said I saw a pair of men who mistook noise for power. I said I saw a woman who measured danger and chose a vector that cut it in half. I said I saw a road that wasn't there until someone who knew it decided it would be. I said I felt the city loosen like a knot in skilled hands. "And you?" she asked. I told her I saw myself stop pretending not to be afraid and do it politely anyway. She smiled then. It changed her face completely. The bus lights softened a notch. "Good," she said. "You'll keep the memory. It may ask something from you later, but not more than you can pay." We let the pair out at the next ordinary stop, where the pavement was just pavement, and the shelter's lights were only lights. The large one touched his throat, as if he'd left his voice on the seat, and could retrieve it if he just reached far enough. The smaller one looked up at the street name and found nothing to hang his certainty on. They walked away like men who had been given back to the world in the wrong order. I lingered by the front, hand on the rail, as if that would let me stay tethered to the rule that kept me safe. The driver watched them go and then looked at me with the same steady mirror gaze. "Time," she said. Her voice made the word a gentle instruction. I thanked her. It felt inadequate, but gratitude is a compass. It points you toward what saved you even when you don't know the address. She waved it off. "Get some sleep. Don't ride righteous after midnight. It makes the road hungry." I should have stepped down then and left it at that. Instead, I stood for one more heartbeat in the doorway and saw the curb with no city again. Just there, superimposed on our street, like an old photograph someone hadn't lined up quite right. It looked patient. It looked like it collected people who said the wrong thing to the wrong night and kept them until the city deserved them back. I came to think of her as a hero. But heroes are a kind of myth you borrow when you can't admit you were saved by a person doing her job well. Weeks later, I saw her again at an hour when the city pretends it is safe by being sleepy. Different route, same shoulders, same mirror. She remembered me by the way you'd remember a regular who doesn't tip badly. "You're walking tonight," she noted. Not asked. I was. I waved. She nodded, satisfied with the choice, the way gardeners are satisfied by rain. They didn't have to forecast. I almost asked her then about the lane, the slate curb, the fare that takes your voice or your route. I didn't. Some questions are a tax you'll never finish paying. I settled for the small one. "Does the bus ever collect from you?" She laughed with her eyes, which is the only place laughter can stay kind in public. "Every night," she said. "That's the trade. I keep the lane. The lane keeps count. It gives me back what it can." "What does it give you?" I asked. "People like you who look at the mirror when it looks at them," she said. "Ones who keep the story straight. Ones who step down where the city is the city and don't get curious about doors." I promised her I wouldn't. I lied a little. I still glance at bus doors, even in daylight, and watch the frames as if they might widen by a millimeter. I still count curbs at corners where no house ever stays occupied for long. I still listen for that other kind of hush, the one that isn't broken by traffic or footsteps, but by the world deciding to put two places together for a while. If you ever find yourself riding late and feeling morally tall, sit up front. Keep your knees out of the aisle. Don't give the night suggestions. And if the bus door opens onto a place that smells like Riverstone and not petrol, stay put. It's not for you. unless the driver says your name without asking. I didn't keep any souvenirs from that night. Unless you count the way I now spot the men who talk big because they're scared, and the women who carry a map of edges in their stance. The bus kept the blade, and the lane kept the memory, and the night kept the name of the stop that wasn't there. That's fine. The city is a body that heals by forgetting, and the bus is a vessel that remembers just enough to steer. Someday, I'll pay another fare. Not money. The other kind. Maybe I'll give up the habit of pretending I can handle it alone. Maybe I'll tell the story to someone who thinks the worst thing that can happen on a bus is boredom, and watch their face change when the driver's mirror finds theirs. Maybe I'll step forward when a pair at the back mistakes volume for dominion and say nothing. Because sometimes silence is the shape of respect. Or maybe I'll do what I did that night. Look at the driver, keep the rule, and leave the lane to her. She's out there. Big woman, steady hands, mirror like a lighthouse. If you ride late, look up. If you feel the bus get lighter, stay still. If a curb with no pavement wants your attention, let it want. The city is generous to the obedient and merciful to the teachable. The lane is not generous. It is exact. It balances the book one passenger at a time. And if you're ever offered a choice between your voice and your route, choose your voice. You can find your way home with a good silence better than you can sing explanations on a road you no longer know. I learned that watching a man touch his throat at a stop bathed in honest streetlight, realizing the night had finally found something of his that it could keep without making a mess. When I stepped off the bus for real, the pavement felt solid in a way I had never noticed, like the world was glad to meet the weight of me again. I thought of saying thank you one more time, but she was already guiding the wheel, eyes on a map I would never see. The door closed with the finality of a sealed envelope. The engine settled into that patient rhythm that belongs to machines that know the way by heart. The mirrors gathered the street and the faces and the neon and sent them to her in the only language the night respects. True and without adornment, she drove on. The city received her. The river turned. Somewhere behind me, in a lane that isn't, a curb waited with the patience of stone. And I went home, grateful that some walls are only there when the right hands need them to be. Story number 2. I thought the night would go where the map said it would. I thought the man behind the wheel worked for safety, not for silence. I thought love could turn any road into a bright ribbon back to the hotel. I thought the countryside was only fields and owls and a sky full of permission. I thought wrong. I was traveling for work in a country I won't name. Not because it deserves secrecy, but because arguments have a way of drowning out the part that matters. My wife, then still my fiancée, had joined me to turn a calendar of meetings into something that felt like a life. We made a pact the first night: talk about numbers by day, learn the shape of the city by evening, and save the wide-shouldered hours of darkness for each other. That plan held for nearly a week. We learned the cafe that didn't rush the bill, the park that smelled like oranges after sundown, the avenue where the buildings wore both lace and steel. There's a kind of charm when old stone leans comfortably against glass. It tells you a country has figured out how to keep memory and momentum at the same table. The last night, we decided to walk past the edges of the brochure. She wanted the long view, the kind of horizon you can't frame on a phone, even if it meant leaving the city's careful lamps behind. We crossed a small bridge, then a second one. The sidewalks thinned into dirt, shouldering the road. The road unrolled into fields. Our conversation took the shape of vows we hadn't spoken yet. The stars showed up one by one, like neighbors you'd always meant to meet. It is a foolish thing to feel invincible just because the sky is generous, but that's exactly what I felt. Hand in hers, heat from the day still folded inside the ground, cool air pouring over us in waves. We sat on a bench that had rusted romantic. A lake mused in the dark, mirror flat, until a fish decided it had an opinion about the surface. We named future dogs, argued affectionately about the number of bedrooms we'd need if the world one day called us parents, and built a home out of sentences. When we finally decided to call it a night, the city felt farther away than an address should. I had picked up a taxi company's card in the hotel lobby, the kind of official paper that pretends to be a promise, and I dialed. A cheerful voice answered. 10 minutes turned into headlights. The driver had the easy smile of someone who wants you to trust him more than he wants a tip. He had the badge, the registration, the same name that glowed on the website when I checked, because I am the sort who checks. He typed the hotel into a GPS rugged enough to fight in a war and invited our small talk to climb into the front seat. His English arrived in fragments, but warmth is its own language, and he had plenty. We settled in the back like returning royalty, relieved to have a plan with wheels. The countryside rearranged itself in the windows, wheat, then scrub, then silhouettes of trees that looked like dark thought bubbles. I noticed the other vehicle, the way you notice a headache before it becomes its own weather, first as a pressure, then as a shape. A van slid in behind us, without lights, a shadow moving inside a larger shadow. I leaned forward. My wife touched my wrist. A quiet question. I told her what I saw. The driver glanced at the mirror, then at us, and smiled the kind of smile that treats concern like a child who needs a nap. He said not to worry. He said some people prefer not to be seen out here. The logic filed a protest in my head. If invisibility were the goal, why follow close enough to borrow our taillights? Why draft us like a wagon in a convoy? I asked. The driver chuckled. The universal punctuation for conversations that will not be taking on new information. The van blinked its lights once, twice, 3 times, then signaled in a way that meant pull over in any language with roads. Our driver's mouth stopped pretending. He said we should stop. My wife, who makes better decisions in emergencies than most committees, said we should not. She said it in a tone that turns bones into steel. The man behind the wheel hesitated and then guided the taxi to the shoulder as if the night itself had asked him nicely. Gravel skated under the tires. The world went still. 3 figures approached. Masks pretended to be faces. Metal pretended to be law. Our driver was guided backward with his hands on his head, wrists wrapped in plastic that bit and shone. I cataloged details because that is what you do when control leaves the room. The way the dust lifted around their boots, the muffled rhythm of their feet, the way the moon turned their silhouettes into letters I couldn't read. My wife's hand found mine. Not a plea, not a panic, just a tether. One man tapped the rear window with a barrel and gestured. We opened the door and stepped into air that felt older than the city. They were efficient, almost bored. Pockets were emptied with a professionalism that suggested practice. My wallet, my phone, my sense that adults are in charge. Gone. My wife's purse collected the rest of the proof that we belonged to a life elsewhere. Then came the order that separates humiliation from theft. Strip. There was a part of me that wanted to offer an essay on dignity, another that considered what it would take to wrestle a weapon from a stranger with steady hands, and a third, the sensible one, that wanted to shepherd my wife through this moment alive. We obeyed down to bones and stubbornness. They laughed, not the laughter of joy, but the small music of power, clothes bundled into their arms, keys traded hands. Our taxi became their second car with a casualness that stung. In less than a minute, there were only 2 engines again, but both of them were leaving. The countryside returned to itself as if nothing had happened. We stood there with only our rings and the insistence of our breath. The road breathed out cold. The horizon hoarded the city. I like to think we started walking because we are brave. The truth is simpler. The body hates a vacuum. We walked because standing still made the dark seem like a decision. We moved because moving felt like telling the night we were not available for whatever it had planned next. The first mile taught me the names of muscles I hadn't met. The second mile taught me that fear has a temperature. I wrapped an abandoned blanket around my waist, like a monk who had read the wrong text. My wife wore the other half as if it were a shawl, chosen on purpose. Her chin lifted. She set a pace that argued with the cold. The road played at being straight, but every bend promised a farmhouse that wasn't there. At last, a gate appeared, then a porch, then a rectangle of light that meant somebody had decided to live where logic said not to. We introduced ourselves without names. No phones, no documents, only voices. Compassion did what bureaucracy couldn't in a dozen calls. A kettle was set to work. A jacket landed on my shoulders and made an argument for humanity that no politician could deliver. Sirens never came, but a dusty cruiser did. Forms were filled, statements were harvested. A number was dialed with the words embassy and mourning attached to it. The officers were technically present. Their interest took the night off. I asked about the driver, the man whose wrists had been cinched behind his back. Shrugs translated themselves across languages. 2 uniforms shared a joke that didn't ask our permission. It wasn't personal. That hurt more. We returned to the hotel as if it had always been a lifeboat with fresh towels. Phones were suspended in guesswork. Cards were canceled. Passports nodded from the safe. Austere and excellent. I lay awake beside the person I had promised to marry and understood that safety isn't a place. It's a practice that fails sometimes. Morning found us committed to departure. One more dinner, we said, near the hotel, early, sensible. We ate in the kind of restaurant where the air tastes like butter before the plates even arrive. The sun folded itself into the low buildings and waved a modest goodbye. Laughter cut through the clatter of silverware. Not loud, just familiar. I looked up and saw a face trying to hide behind joy. The driver. Not bound, not bruised, celebrating. 3 men sat with him, their gestures easy, their smiles the kind you share after overtime has gone your way. Our eyes met. His expression fell off his face and landed somewhere near my shoes. I moved through bodies and chairs and a geography of elbows toward the table. But shame runs fast when it has been rehearsed. He was gone by the time I arrived. The other 3 stayed as if the evening were a performance, and they'd already bought tickets. I asked questions in English because it had worked most of the week. Suddenly, it failed to exist. They understood only when it was time to smirk. One of them squinted at my shirt and offered a compliment that felt like a fingerprint. I realized in that moment that the gun's voice had been bluff more than thunder, that the kidnapping had been theater with cheap props, that the countryside had been a stage built for our trust to fall through. Relief and anger elbowed each other for space in my chest. Relief one by a nose. No one had died. Anger demanded a speech anyway. I did not deliver it. We returned to the hotel and closed the door and let the lock have the last word. In the morning, we left with less than we brought and more than we wanted. Suspicion that travels well, gratitude that stays. There's an epilogue, I tell myself. Not because it's true, but because it moves the blood back to where it belongs. I imagine the driver counting his cut and discovering it can't buy sleep. I imagine the men in masks removing them and finding their faces smaller. I imagine the field where we stood remembering us, the way grass remembers storms, and deciding to grow anyway. People will tell you travel teaches you who you are. Sometimes it only reminds you who other people can be. I learned that love is a kind of map that makes wrong turns survivable. I learned that I can carry my wife's fear without dropping my own. I learned that a night can take everything you can hold in your hands and still fail to take what matters. If you ask whether I'll return to that country, I'll tell you a story about a blanket shaped like dignity, and a porch light shaped like mercy, and a city that looked beautiful, even as we said goodbye too quickly. I'll tell you that harm is not a location. It isn't a people. It is an opportunity some choose and others refuse. We met both kinds in one long evening. We put them in our pockets with our new passports and carried them through security and into the next chapter, where the sky still does its bright, ordinary work across fresh roofs and tired roads. And yes, when the car came to take us to the airport, we checked everything twice. Some lessons don't ask to be learned again. I kept the card from the hotel lobby anyway. It sits now in a drawer that has collected small lies I once believed, points of contact that never were, guarantees without witnesses. On the days when the news is loud, I take the card out and feel the cheap paper with its confident logo, and I remember how trust feels in your palm before it turns into ash. Then I put it back and reach for the person who walked naked and unafraid beside me under an indifferent moon. And I think the world will always have men who prefer a script to a conscience. The world will also have strangers who open doors, pour water, and believe you before the paperwork is done. That's enough to keep traveling. That's enough to start again tomorrow, hand in hand, down a road that ends where we say it does. Story number 3. I thought the city taught me everything, until a crowded bus at dusk reminded me how quietly danger can sit beside you. I believed the aisle lights were enough to keep the shadows honest, until one pair of eyes refused to blink. I trusted my instincts, until a stranger's hand on my arm stopped me from making a choice that could have changed my life forever. I counted on noise to warn me, until fear moved without a sound and a blade glinted like a thin, cold smile. I figured I was invisible until the past stood up in an old man's body and showed me what courage looks like when it hurts to stand. I was a broke student riding the bus through San Francisco. The kind of commute you take because the city eats time along with quarters. The air wavered with trapped heat and the sour memory of 1,000 strangers. I slid into a seat near the middle, pressed in by elbows, backpacks, and the usual arithmetic of surviving public transit. On my right, a man in worn, civilian clothes sat with rough, cut knuckles and commuter stillness. He checked his watch, then the window, then the aisle, in a rhythm that felt like someone counting exits. I wrote him off as another impatient local, until I noticed the other guy. He was pale in a way that made his sweat look colder than it should be. A sickly shine across a face stretched too tight. A thick coat in summer. Trembling hands worrying at the seam of his seat. And eyes that kept hopping cars like they were scanning for a safer street. I'd seen addiction before in this city, but the way he mapped the bus felt like he was measuring people, not distance. When his stare found the old man across the aisle, gray hair, a corduroy jacket polished by years of use, a paperback folded open like a tent, I felt a wire hum behind my ribs. The bus lurched through an intersection. Neon slashed across the windows, turning everyone into makeshift suspects. The shaky guy stood. He didn't so much walk as detach and drift, pulled by something heavier than his decisions. He reached the old man, leaned down, put a hand on that thin shoulder like he owned it. The old man flinched, eyes rising slow, the way people look when they're trying to wake into a better reality. The pale man said something low and fast, the kind of words you only ever hear in the aftermath when you're trying to remember if there was a warning. Then his hand slid to his back pocket and came up carrying a promise no one wanted. A small blade, bright as a bad thought. Switchblade. I didn't think. I unfolded from my seat. A plan already lying to me about how useful I could be. Maybe I could move behind him. Maybe I could wrap his wrist. Maybe I could be the version of myself who doesn't freeze. I rose into that idea until the man beside me snagged my sleeve and pulled me down, hard enough to make the whole bus tilt in my head. "Don't be an idiot, hero," he murmured. For a second, I misunderstood him. I thought he was another wolf asking me not to spook the sheep. My lungs turned thin. 2 blades, 2 men, 1 me. Then he climbed over me into the aisle with a speed that did not belong to a commuter. He straightened, shoulders squaring into a posture that made sense of his stillness. "Freeze! This is the police." The word police changed the air. It stacked all our breaths into a held note. The junk-thin man pivoted, body moving on panic math. His arm came up with the knife. The bus driver saw the collision of futures and stamped the brakes. Momentum chose a side. The man who had said police stumbled forward, twisted to save his life, and still met the blade. It disappeared into his upper arm, a clean, cruel punctuation. He fell back, eyes wide, one hand clamped to his bicep, where the handle jutted out like a wrong door sticking out of his bicep. He told me, not me, but all of us, without raising his voice, do not pull it free. Blood turned his sleeve dark. The pale man looked at his empty hand, then at the handle, then at the cop, like maybe he could rewind to the choice where the pocket held nothing. He stepped forward to reclaim the knife and whatever control he thought it gave him. What happened next arrived from the past. The old man rose, not fast, not dramatic, simply correct. He caught the blade hand wrist with 2 fingers and a thumb, rotated, and the younger man folded as if some invisible hinge had been found and pressed. An arm lock is quiet when it's done right. The old man used the seat frame for leverage, his face not angry, but strangely focused, like he was fixing a stubborn jar. The trembling body hit the aisle, tripped by technique, not by strength. 2 other passengers finally became versions of themselves they could live with and piled in, pressing the man down, fingers splayed, elbows braced. I went to the off-duty cop, knelt, pushed against my own fear of doing it wrong. His jaw clenched, but his eyes were clear. He repeated it. Leave the knife where it is. I nodded, swallowed the uselessness, and became hands, steadying, pressing, answering questions from a voice that had learned to give orders without shouting. Someone hit the cord, someone called it in. The bus kept crawling toward the station, because even drama has a schedule in San Francisco. I used to think heroism looks like speed. That night, it looked like patience. The city unspooled outside while we became a temporary community. A woman gave up her scarf to tighten a bandage. A teenager shadowed the old man's grip in case his hands shook. A cook in a stained apron stood sentry at the front, telling anyone who tried to push past that the ride was detained by reality. When we pulled in, uniforms rushed the doors with the certainty of people who know what to do next. They took the pale man, his face finally slack, his lips moving in the math of regret. They saw the man with the blade in his arm, and they softened their shoulders in recognition. Off duty. Not a stranger, after all. He apologized to me for grabbing my sleeve earlier, the way professionals apologize for breaking the rules of politeness in order to keep you breathing. He thanked me for not touching the handle, thanked the woman for the scarf, thanked the driver for the brakes that turned a deadly angle into a wound a person can keep. The old man sat back down like he had just stood to let someone pass. A paramedic looked at his hands as if hands could tell stories. Later, I learned what the bones already knew. The old man had been a retired, disabled Vietnam vet, a survivor who carried techniques instead of souvenirs. He didn't posture. He didn't narrate. He wore history like a cardigan. The off-duty cop let them take the knife out somewhere clean, then asked if I was okay. I wasn't the target. Not really. But fear does not care about the math. It lingers. It echoes in windows and makes the route home feel like a test you didn't study for. For months, I sat near the front, scanned reflections for hands that wouldn't behave, monitored jackets that were wrong for the season. I kept thinking about moments that hinge a night. A wrist rotated, a shoulder squared, a brake pressed. I kept thinking about the sentence I almost wrote with my body when I stood up to be useful. And I kept returning to the quiet choreography that saved us. One man who carried the law even without the uniform, and one man who carried a war without wanting to. I wish I could say the city felt safer after that, that learning the shape of intervention made me brave. The truth is simpler and sharper. Courage is not a costume you put on. It is a habit you practice in small rooms and crowded buses. I learned to see the difference between acting and helping. I learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is not do the thing that satisfies your ego. I learned to notice who is counting exits, who is pretending not to, and who might be rehearsing something they don't want to perform. I still ride at night when the lights smear the glass and the neighbors become silhouettes. When the bus leans into a stop and strangers jostle their way toward logic. I look for the old man in someone else's posture, the way an elbow speaks, the way a hand waits instead of shakes. And on the worst nights, when the city feels like a test again, I remember how quietly the past stood up and how a blade can lose to a grip that was practiced decades ago and never forgotten. If you ever find yourself on a bus with trouble standing, measure your help by its usefulness, not its drama. Remember that the right word at the right second, police, can reset the room. Remember that the wrong motion at the wrong time, pulling the knife, can turn a wound into an ending. And if you are lucky, remember that some lessons arrive in the bodies of the elderly, in techniques taught long ago under a different sky. I went home that night gentler and sharper. I slept lightly for a while, listening, not for noises, but for choices starting to move in people who didn't want to make them. I woke different. The city was the same. And somewhere, I hoped, The old man's hands finally rested, that his grip ached in the good way, and that the man who wore the badge under civilian clothes kept telling impatient kids to sit down before they stood into something they couldn't survive. Story number 4. 5 hours into the dark. The cabin felt like a floating city, and I was its lone pedestrian. There are nights when the sky looks close enough to touch. This was not one of them. It pressed down like a ceiling. I kept studying the airplane bathroom door. How narrow it is. How a person can turn a frame into a wall. I wanted an ordinary flight and got a lesson in how a stranger's appetite can become a prison. By the time we crossed cold water, I understood that endurance sometimes means holding still. I should tell you where it began. This happened to me last year. I was taking a flight from Atlanta to Tokyo to visit my partner, who was working over there. I promised myself I would treat the journey like a project, break it into tasks, regulate my breath, reward little victories. I get kind of nervous about flying, and the prospect of a 15-hour flight was not one I was looking forward to. I curated calm, tracks that steady the pulse, a novel with short chapters like stepping stones, a guided body scan saved to my phone. I pictured the ocean as a long, quiet hallway we would pass through and come out new on the other side. I told myself the extra space would help. Maybe if I could avoid screaming babies and had a bit more legroom, things could be less stressful. I cashed in points for a wider seat and the illusion of control. Eventually, just before boarding, I decided that it was all too much and dropped a diazepam. The jet bridge was a tunnel of coats and rolling bags. I made my way onto the plane as one of the first to board, stowed my bag in the overhead compartment, and settled into my window seat, and promptly fell asleep. Sleep dulled the edge of everything. The fuselage became a shell, and I slipped inside it. When I drifted back, the world had narrowed to a wing and an oval of glass. The next thing I knew, I'd sleepwalked my way through the pre-flight checks and the takeoff, and was only vaguely aware that I even had a next-door neighbor in the seat beside mine. A flight attendant paused. I lifted a hand. I asked for a bottle of sparkling mineral water, which was delicious and refreshing and calmed my nerves. I let the bubbles be the only noise I paid attention to. For a little while, I convinced myself this would be a quiet passage across the map. That hope ended when a large presence collapsed into the seat at my elbow and nudged the glass on my tray. With a heavy plop, my neighbor landed in his seat, almost causing my sparkling mineral water to spill. I turned, expecting a quick apology. Instead, I met a face already close to mine, eyes dilated, attention fixed on me like a stage light. "I'm Declan," the person said, voice blurred at the edges by whatever they had been drinking. They had a big ginger beard, bleach blonde, spiky hair, eyeliner, a septum ring, various other piercings, and one of those flesh tunnels in their ears, and these very wide pupils. Their presence felt engineered to be noticed. Declan began to narrate their life at me. They told me that they were non-binary and used he, him, and they, them pronouns. Then came the resume. An MMA promoter, a playwright, a visionary, preparing to fuse two worlds with the gravity of their talent. They talked at me non-stop for almost an hour. I nodded on a schedule, every few sentences, just enough to conserve energy and to avoid provoking more. The scent rolling off their clothes mixed with the dry cabin air until my eyes watered. I set a timer inside my head. Make it to the aisle. Make it to the door. Make it to the mirror. There are moments on long flights where the horizon tilts inside you. Mine came when the seatbelt sign went dark. I pointed to the aisle and waited for Declan to fold their legs, even with the extra space in business class. I was forced to brush and squeeze up against them to get past. The aisle felt like a shoreline, the galley, a small field station of patient faces. In the bathroom, I pressed my palms to the cool sink and matched my breath to the fan. I didn't need the room. I needed a door that closed. I planned the return like a mission. Neutral face, headphones, a podcast I could disappear into, a closed door inside my head. I opened the bathroom door. I was met face to face with Declan. They leaned in, not touching, and performed a deliberate inhale as if cataloging the air I had just vacated. They made direct, unblinking eye contact with me, as if to say, "Yeah, you saw what I just did." Their forearm slid across the frame and turned space into barrier. They suggested that I join the Mile High Club with them. The suggestion arrived as if it were a favor they were offering me, as if my yes already existed and simply needed to be discovered. "No," I said. I placed the word carefully, like a flat stone on a sheet of paper. They stepped forward at a measured pace that assumed I would retreat. They began gently but firmly stepping forward, as if to make me back up into the bathroom. When I didn't move, their eyebrows lifted with theatrical surprise. Then came an accusation dressed in politics. If I declined, perhaps that meant I had a problem with people outside the binary. They asked if the reason that I wouldn't have intercourse with them in the airplane bathroom was because I had a problem with non-binary people. It was a trick that tried to switch the topic from consent to ideology, as if my boundary were a referendum my life answered for me. I held my finger up with my engagement ring on it and said, "No, it's because my future wife wouldn't approve." The metal catching cabin light steadied me. Their fist tightened against the doorframe, controlled, precise, a small demonstration. They quietly but firmly punched the wall. I ducked under their arm and walked back to my seat as if I had just remembered a task. As I passed a flight attendant, I asked for another water in 5 minutes. A simple sentence that, in context, meant, "Please check on us soon." He understood in the careful way people trained for emergencies do. He returned without spectacle and lingered, adjusting a shade, asking whether I needed anything else. Declan's posture hardened. When we were unsupervised, the performance changed. The voice lowered. The words curdled. They muttered the most vile, unpleasant violence toward me. It came in fragments, a broken mirror monologue that kept cutting even when I tried not to listen. I studied the safety card and counted the lines in the diagram as if they were beads on a string. I was trapped by the window for another 10 hours. Every minute had edges, every edge shaved a little more resolve. They kept it up for the entire flight. The threats were rarely direct, which is the dark skill of this kind of behavior. Enough deniability to make you doubt your own threshold. A murmur about that woman. A hypothetical about what might happen to someone who thought they were better than strangers. A thin smile as the crew walked by. When an attendant paused, the voice turned polite again. A reversible jacket shrugged on for company, landing unfurled like a long-held breath. The cabin filled with the rustle of plans being put back on like coats. I waited. Declan did not move at first, as if they had purchased the right to be a roadblock. The same attendant returned and cracked the stalemate with a simple sentence about deplaning. They took their overhead luggage and left. My muscles registered the absence before my mind did. Only then did I tell the attendant the careful version people use after danger has passed. He advised documenting it, even reporting it to the authorities on arrival. I nodded, the way you nod when you are already too tired to carry the story any further, but stories do not stay put. On the train into the city, I scanned each car for that particular arrangement of beard and hair. In the hotel lobby, I sat where I could see the street. My partner noticed my posture and asked for the story. I gave her the short version. She listened the way people do when they love you and want to put their body between you and the past. She put water on for tea and left the bathroom door open while she brushed her teeth so I would not feel alone with a mirror. At night, I replayed the door frame, the light on my ring, the way a stranger tried to turn consent into an argument and then label my refusal a prejudice. I imagined doing everything differently, requesting a seat change immediately, naming the behavior in front of a crew member, enlisting the person across the aisle to switch. There is a kind of retroactive courage that feels true, even though it is a postcard from what-if land. The real courage, I think now, was staying who I was in a space that tried to make me someone else. Here is a quieter hook. Tucked into the middle of the tale. The cabin is a laboratory for power. You cannot open the window. You cannot take a walk around the block. You cannot choose your company. What you can do is refuse to move backward into a room you do not want to enter. You can hold up your hand and let the ring catch the light like a small shield. You can recruit the attention of someone trained to notice small storms. Tokyo did what Tokyo always does for me. It distracted. It fed me small bowls of clarity. It allowed me to be a visitor inside streets that hum with intention. We walked under lanterns, rode escalators that moved like rivers, watched the organized blur of a station at rush hour. Some nights I slept. Some nights I lay awake and counted lit windows in a high-rise across from our rental. I kept thinking about that accusation, how it tried to turn an ordinary boundary into evidence against me. The trick is old. Rename a no as a defect. The answer has to be older. A no is a sentence that completes itself. On the last day before I flew home, we visited a garden shaped like a thought. Stones arranged as if language could be placed on the ground. Water moving without hurry. I breathed without counting. For a moment, I did not brace at footsteps behind me. Eventually, we landed. That line from earlier kept echoing, as if the real landing had to happen inside me. Back at the airport, waiting to board for the return trip. I wrote 2 letters I will probably never send. One to the airline, explaining how a quiet check-in from a flight attendant can be the difference between endurance and despair. And one to the stranger who turned a doorway into a verdict. The second letter contained only one sentence. I will not be collared by your hunger. If you have ever sat beside a stranger who took your stillness for permission, you know this next part already. The body becomes a boundary you defend with sentences and patience. The smallest kindness from another passenger or a member of the crew becomes a shoreline. Time stretches into a long hallway where certainty feels like a locked office. Then you find a key in your pocket that looks like your own voice, and it opens just enough. I know this might not be the most directly terrifying story you've received, but dread is not a genre. It is a set of physical instructions. Mine told me to sit still, to keep my face neutral, to measure my breath, to wait for the wheels to find ground. It told me to resist stepping backward into a room where my choices would be narrowed to yes or yes. It told me to take a long shower at the hotel and let water erase the narrow door someone thought they could own. If you need a last hook, take this one. Safety is sometimes the boring hero of the story. It looks like staying put. It sounds like the even tone of a crew member asking whether you would like another water. It feels like the cool circle of a ring, reminding you of the life you choose. It ends with a city opening in front of you. Not because you are fearless, but because you kept your boundary intact. Story number 5. I used to think the ocean only took what drifted too close. Then I met the girl who tried to feed it me. There are faces you forget, and faces that follow you into closed eyes. Hers waits by a rail, with salt on her lips and a dare in her voice. I was 16, full of borrowed music and counterfeit confidence, when I learned how charm can be cruelty with eyeliner. Some people steal wallets. She stole air from the rooms she walked through. If first love is a lighthouse, Sasha was a dead bulb on a storm night. I grew up where ships are as common as buses, where family photos have metal gangways instead of porches. Port Miami wasn't special to me. Heat shimmered off the terminal. Everyone damp and excited. And I was that kind of teenager who measured sincerity in eye rolls. During the safety drill, I scanned for someone else who hated the pageantry as much as I did. That's when I saw her. Black clothes that drank sunlight, a pentagram necklace bright as a dare, and a smile that said she'd seen better disasters. She introduced herself the way people light matches near gasoline. "Hi, I'm Sasha," she said. "I hate most things on principle." She didn't use the word kindness. She didn't need to. Her eyes did the opposite. I told her my name. I told her nothing useful. I didn't mention Robin, my older sister, who could smell trouble the way sailors smell rain. We crossed paths again near the arcade, the ship humming through the Mediterranean like it owned the horizon. Kids crowded a cabinet of House of the Dead 2, sweeping plastic guns while missing everything that mattered. Sasha stood by the ashtray, watching like a director of a play about failure. She offered commentary without volume, a kind of slow bleed of contempt. When I laughed at one of her lines, she rewarded me with attention, and at 16, that felt like a tide pulling at my ankles. She showed me shadows first. The back corner where cameras didn't reach. The cheap panel on a ticket machine that could be coaxed open. She noticed the chain on my wallet before she noticed the wallet. I followed. And that's on me. I learned how machines give up when someone asks without shame. I learned how a win can feel wrong even before it lands in your hand. A string of tickets fell. 10, maybe. She took them, flicked them into the trash, and smiled like she'd thrown away a prayer. "Practice," she said. "For something real." The something real happened in the atrium. She asked me to watch from the central staircase as she slipped into a river of families. Shoulders, handbags, careless zippers. She stumbled without falling, apologized without meaning, touched without leaving fingerprints. By the time she returned, her jacket clicked with new weight. She opened it in a staff-only nook. A wristwatch, a bracelet, wallets, and the confused throb of other people's days. I told her we'd get caught. She told me I'd get blamed. She rehearsed a story where I was a villain, and she was a child who had survived me. She said it casually, like weather. I believed her because imagination is a weapon when you're young and frightened. She peeled cash and fed the rest down a garbage chute, like sacrificing offerings to a steel god. You'd think that would be enough to set a boundary. It wasn't. I kept showing up. She kept testing what I'd allow. The arcade was only a preface. Sasha preferred stages with smaller audiences. She liked the playroom, where soft flooring swallowed footsteps, and the walls promised safety with pastel drawings. She knelt beside a girl, coloring by herself, and told a story about a woman who went over the rail and didn't come back. She chose adjectives like knives and described currents as if she'd hired them. When the child asked for a mother, Sasha offered an anatomy lesson in fear. The little girl ran. Sasha laughed with no sound, her mouth making a shape that belonged in colder rooms. I told her to stop. She told me it was a joke. I told her it wasn't funny. She told me I was boring. We both told the truth. She took me to the crew corridors and proposed we rob a vending machine. Some poor staffer will take the hit, she said. It's a victimless crime if you never meet the victim. I refused. She pried at the keypad with a metal edge until the panel bent like a warning. That was when I understood she wasn't trying to impress me. She was trying to locate the floor in me. I thought running would help. I ran to the deck with the water park, to chlorinated joy and inflatable decor, to a place where nothing terrible should happen. I half expected she wouldn't follow. She arrived in a black bikini with a word stitched across it that made everyone else a target. She had a box of push pins tucked where swimsuits hide contraband, and proposed a science experiment. Let gravity and careless feet make a memory. I said no. I said there were children. I said my sister Robin was somewhere in the pool. Jealousy moved through her, like a weather system. She asked if my sister was smarter, cooler, prettier. I said the truth, which is that beauty is not a useful conversation to have about your sibling. Sasha didn't care about usefulness. The only solution I could live with was theft. I took the box and tossed it over the rail. The ocean kept the secret. She didn't rage. She smiled. Test passed, she said, and promised a smoking area rendezvous after dark. The sort of promise that sounds like a prize when you're 16 and not thinking in full sentences. At dinner, my fork moved, but nothing else did. My parents planned shows and placed bets on which sunset would be best. Robin had new friends and a schedule. I had a meeting with a person who treated boundaries like personal challenges. There is a hallway on every ship where the light feels thinner. Mine led to the upper deck. Wind pushing at my shirt like an impatient hand. She came out of the shadow already angry, a storm that had skipped the forecast. She catalogued my sins, the pins, the disobedience, the moral superiority of a boy who thinks he's better than her while still basking in her gravity. Then she told me what I had to do. She pointed to the rail and told me to climb. She said I'd be fine. She said it would be funny. She said I had to prove I loved her, or at least prove I feared for Robin enough to be useful. She sprinkled details she shouldn't have known. Cabin number, habits, the friends my sister had collected like seashells. Threats are only stories until they include precise nouns. I looked down. Water makes its own darkness, even at noon. At night, it is a throat. Ships the size of cities carve undertows that don't care who you were on land. You can survive the drop and still be a name your parents don't say out loud. No, I told her. She hated that word. What happened next didn't take long. She went for the center of me and squeezed with a brawler's logic. Pain turns arguments into instincts. I grabbed for anything that could change the angle, and my hand found a life belt mounted on the rail. I swung. It connected. It broke. She fell back, shock on her face, like she'd discovered gravity was rude. I shouted for help, and help arrived the way it does on ships. Too late to prevent the worst possibility. Early enough to stop the second worst. Cameras watched with bad manners from far away. Strangers told their versions. Security listened with faces that said they'd heard parts of this story before. Maybe with other names. Maybe with no names at all. I told everything. The cornhole tickets. The wallets. The garbage chute. The vending machine. The playroom monologue that turned a child's drawing into a prophecy. Every detail was a splinter I wanted out of me. I expected punishment and got supervision. My parents closed around Robin and me like a lighthouse lens. We did family activities with the intensity of people pretending nothing had happened. Security couldn't place Sasha on a manifest. They checked cabins, cross-referenced faces, came back with a theory you don't expect to hear on vacation. If a girl isn't a passenger and doesn't admit to crew, there's only one explanation that travels well. Stowaway. They put her somewhere with a locked door and waited for land that understood paperwork. I imagined her pacing like a tide in a small room. Rage burning clean. I wondered if she ever slept. When you're 16, consequences are vague shapes your parents point at. This one had corners. The ship carried us forward and backward at the same time, toward ports with souvenir shops, and back to Port Miami, where decisions would be handed off like luggage. I tried to enjoy the shows. I laughed at a comedian and hated myself for the sound it made in my chest. Every night, the ocean said the same thing it always says. Nothing. I wished it would answer. I asked my father to ask the right person the right questions. He came back with the kind of shrug adults use when doors stay closed. "No guardian," he said. "No paperwork, no match on the guest list." There was a suggestion implied in the careful way he spoke. A crew member's mistake or secret. A child who had learned to survive by becoming smoke. If so, the crew member wasn't admitting it. And the ship could not afford whispers about that kind of fire in that strange vacuum. My sister flourished, like nothing bad had happened, because she is good at joy. I loved her for that. I hated that Sasha had turned my love into a lever. I walked decks I hadn't noticed before. I memorized doors I would never open. I leaned on rails and thought about the physics of falling, the arrogance it takes to assume a body belongs to the air more than the sea. I thought about how many kids might have played near sharp things if I hadn't thrown a little box away. If I'm honest, my hands shook when I wasn't paying attention. On the second-to-last night, my father said he'd spoken to the head of security again. "No developments," he told me. "Bureaucracy can be a lullaby or a sentence." I didn't know which one I was listening to. I didn't see Sasha again. Not her shoes, not her stare, not that necklace that pretended to be a compass for the damaged. The ship slid into Port Miami like a coin into a pocket, and officials appeared with the patience of people who live inside checklists. Somewhere below decks, a girl paced. Somewhere in a file that might not exist, a name refused to be written down. You expect closure, like a door. You get fog. Years later, I can still feel the texture of that life belt in my palm. I can still hear the almost laughter she made when I disappointed her in the exact right way. If I met 16-year-old me now, I'd tell him to run sooner and tell an adult faster, to treat red flags like fire instead of fashion. But there's a different truth I learned from her, one I hate owing to a stranger. Evil doesn't always announce itself with a costume. Sometimes it's a girl at a smoking area saying the word prove. Sometimes it's a story you're too embarrassed to interrupt. Sometimes it's a boy who thinks consent is only for romance and forgets it applies to risk. I had no business trying to be interesting to someone who fed on the parts of me I didn't respect yet. I think about the kids in the playroom. I hope they forgot her voice. I think about the wallets and their owners, the hassle of canceling credit cards, the small, sour bruise of feeling watched. I think about the crew member who might have been a parent, or might have looked away, or might not exist. I think about the version of me who climbed the rail and didn't finish the story. Here's the last true thing I can say. The ocean takes what it wants. But that night, I didn't give it a choice. I held on. I swung. I asked for help. I told the truth, and it turned out to be just enough. And her name was probably never Sasha. Story number 6. I used to think the city emptied at midnight, like a stage after a play. Props left standing, lights humming, nobody watching. I used to think a crowded place was the safest place in the world. I used to think a staircase led only one way, down to a train, down to home. I used to think a rescuer wore a suit and carried a briefcase. Now I know the spiral has more than one center. October in London was warm until the rain decided to discipline the streets. It arrived in sheets, punishing and absolute, turning the neon into smeared watercolor. I had drifted from a friend's plan into my own. A small pocket of time after a disappointing night out. The city can be kinder to the solitary than to the hopeful. By last call, I wasn't in the mood to be charming, only to be carried home underground by the reliable blue stripe of the Piccadilly line. Covent Garden was the nearest station. I preferred to avoid it because of the lifts and because of the staircase that feels like a dare. But I was wet, irritated, and cold enough to negotiate with my fears. The rain needled my scalp as I crossed the concourse. A man hunched near the bins, trembling under a coat that had lost its shape years ago. I told myself the only promise the night owed me was an empty carriage and a hot kettle at the other end. The spiral began as it always does. Clean tile, a steel grate, the center column rising like the inside of a lighthouse. I stepped in, and the sound of the city flattened behind me. Covent Garden's staircase is a throat. Once inside, you speak in whispers whether you intend to or not. The steps curled and counted, a private metronome. I wore heels because the earlier version of me had counted on being seen. The present version of me was counting the steps. The first dozen softened my breath. The second dozen brought me beneath the appetite of the rain. That was when I noticed the other beat, a footfall behind me. Weight placed carefully, almost shy. I paused. Silence pooled in the metal spine. I walked. The other sound walked with me. I told myself it was echo. Echo is a kind lie you tell your heart while it lifts a shield. The cadence didn't match my pace, though. It hovered just out of sync, as if a metronome in another room were set fractionally faster. When I stopped again, whoever was on the stairs stopped too. My fingers found my keys in my bag, metal teeth turned outward, small and ceremonial. I am not a fighter, but I can pretend to be one when a corridor convinces me there is only forward and back. I imagined slipping off my shoes, but I imagined, too, the grime and the damp and the invisible sharpness that waits where thousands of shoes have been careless. I told myself that the platform would promise witnesses. I told myself that trains are rhythm, and rhythm is safety. The steps multiplied. The air cooled. I was no longer sure how far I had descended, because the building had taken away my sense of straight lines. The spiral cannot be measured by the eyes, only by the legs. The sound behind me kept the distance it chose. Not a chase, not a casual descent, something in between. A fisherman walking the riverbank, line unspooled, every few turns of the helix. I stopped and looked up. A shadow lingered where the handrail disappeared, a shape that learned from my pauses and offered its own. I started to narrate quietly to myself, a habit from school days when fear needed vocabulary. You're fine. Stairs end, trains arrive. People exist at the bottom of things, a memory intruded, like a television left on in another room. A film from those university nights where beer tasted like loyalty and villains dressed in leather or smiles. In that film, the call was always to come out and play. The phrase looped in my head now, not as taunt, but as a door to myself. Come out and move. Come out and refuse to be staged. The staircase stank faintly of damp fabric and colder metal. The grate beside me showed a column of darkness. Now and then, a pale stripe of wall glided by. Then more darkness. The city is full of spaces that don't belong to anyone. In those spaces, you can become whatever the next person decides you are. The last bend delivered me to the low tunnel that runs like a vein to the platform. Relief first, then the correction. The platform was empty. The display announced a train 3 minutes away, which can be an hour if you need it to be. The absence of people made the station feel like a dream of a station, a model on a salesman's table. Perfect, useless, silent. I moved along the wall, claiming the shelter of the vending machine, more out of instinct than sense. A voice said, "You okay?" And I started so hard, it shook a laugh out of me that wasn't a laugh at all. A man stepped from the other side of the machine, trim, rainless, tie still convincing the world it was early afternoon, middle-aged, the kind of face a niece might trust at a wedding, a briefcase by his shoe, a small, clean smile. He had the tone of someone who knows how to help in airports. I told him the simplest version, footsteps matching mine on the stairs, a presence that preferred my pauses. His eyebrows performed skepticism politely, probably someone else trying not to be weird, he said, and I wanted to agree. The station trains you to want the reasonable answer. He stayed near, not close enough to crowd. And in that choreography, I felt myself rescued into the shape of a person who would, in 3 minutes, have a train and a seat and a story to roll her eyes about. "See?" he said, glancing down the tunnel. No one there. What arrived around the corner was not no one. She was young, in the way exhaustion makes people look young, features sharpened by hunger, eyes wide from too many nights where sleep is something that happens to other people. Wet hair flattened to her head, a jacket that had once been somebody else's plan. Her shoes didn't match, a tired trainer with a ghost of white, a black high top torn into a grin of fabric, traced with a stripe of pink that had survived the storms. She moved with the attempt to be invisible that only makes a person brighter. She looked the way a shadow looks when it decides to be seen. She scanned the platform and saw me. Then she saw the man beside me. Fear altered her face so quickly, it felt like a trick of the lights. She made a small, helpless sound, and then turned, not in indecision, but in flight, and the remnants of her footsteps marked the tiles as she went back the way she had come. I stood there with my rescuer, and the rescue wrapped itself around me, warm as a borrowed coat. Something inside me uncoiled. Trains, I told myself, and clocks, and other passengers. These would return. The train arrived exactly when the sign had insisted it would. He gestured with open courtesy, and I followed him into the softness of a carriage. The window clattered quietly. The floor hummed, and the stations folded past like chapters. He asked where I was headed. Southgate, I said. So am I, he answered, as if coincidence were a service the underground offered now and then. We spoke about small, safe things, coursework, how there is always a party, and the party is always too loud, football in a summer that already felt like a story somebody else told. He did not posture. He did not perform. He was the kind of company you thank in doorways at Southgate. He walked with me through the calm dark of residential streets. We stopped short of a particular door because the code to the building is a friendship, not a courtesy. He wished me good night with a nod I could have given my uncle. Inside, the kettle tripped the switch and the steam made the kitchen sound alive. Safety can be an illusion, but it is also a lullaby. I let it sing me into calm. It was only later, with words spilling to a friend who knows all the labels on my fears, that the second spiral began. We were laughing about how a glare from a stranger can be better than a lecture from the police, when she turned my story like a coin and asked what exactly had frightened that girl on the platform. Not me, not the storm, not the possibility of authority. She hadn't looked shocked to see another passenger. She had looked like someone who recognized fire. She had looked at him the way the body looks at a scar you keep pretending is old. Recognition, I decided, is not always about names. It can be a posture, a scent of control, a presence your nerves remember. The city contains so many versions of danger that sometimes they recognize one another faster than you do. If she had followed me down those stairs, she intended something, perhaps clumsy, perhaps cruel, perhaps nothing more than cornering a stranger for the weight in her bag. But when she saw him, whatever plan she owed herself was cancelled by a debt I could not see. She fled the way people flee the past when it catches up in a well-lit place. I replayed the angles, the way he had been waiting where the vending machine could hide a person who was not hiding, how the platform was empty, as if booked for a meeting between three people who did not know they had been invited. I asked myself why his kindness had felt so properly measured. Some rescues arrive with too much light and tell you they are rescues. His arrived with exact change. If he were, in some other story, the villain, he would be the kind that needs no volume. He would be the kind the city builds offices for. This is where good sense ought to intervene. He walked me home. I arrived unharmed. I owe the man gratitude for the detour he took into my fear. And yet the spiral insists on one more turn. Gratitude can live next door to dread. I know this now. I turned the possibility in my mind until it made me tired that she had not been stalking me. Not exactly, but her own private definition of safety, keeping me in sight because I was walking toward someone she could not bear to see, or that she had, once, been the kind of young person who believed men in suits make the world safer, until the world corrected her, or that both things were true, and the city, as always, was running multiple stories on the same track. I do not know. The truth is a locked carriage you can see through but cannot enter. What I know is that when I take Covent Garden late at night now, I avoid the lifts, and I avoid the stairs, and I avoid my own arrogance. If the rain drives me underground, I plan the descent like a spelunker. Practical shoes, brisk pace, no performance of bravery for ghosts of strangers. I do not mistake an empty platform for a promise. I do not mistake a suit for an oath. I do not mistake recognition for safety. If there is a lesson, it is not the sort that lives on a poster. It is the kind that whispers when your hand reaches for the rail. Every spiral has more than one center. You may not be the story's center tonight. You may never learn whose center you walked through, or why your shadow borrowed shapes that were not yours. One person followed me down those stairs. Another waited where the tunnel ended. I went home. That is the simplest version. The true version keeps turning, sometimes. Standing by the ticket barriers years later, I try to picture his face older, padded by time, a newspaper headline chewing on his name. I try to imagine the girl with the mismatched shoes finally stepping into a morning that trusts her. I try to imagine both of them as ghosts who are still living, because the city is full of people you will only meet once, but will carry forever. The rain has learned to fall kinder on me since then. Or perhaps I learned to move before it starts. Either way, I take the train and I walk the stairs, and I hold two truths in the same hand. A stranger saved me, and a stranger scared a stranger away. Between those truths, the city spins, and I stand in the middle, listening for a footfall that may not be mine.